On live TV, Ashton Kutcher didn't hold back against Joy Behar, and the tension in the room instantly shifted. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One where a guest and a seasoned host find themselves carefully but firmly disagreeing in front of a live audience. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins like many segments do on The View, with a warm introduction, light applause, and a sense that the conversation will follow a familiar, comfortable rhythm. On this particular episode, Ashton Kutcher is welcomed to the table. He's there primarily to discuss his recent work and ongoing advocacy efforts, something he's become increasingly known for in recent years. The panel greets him with polite enthusiasm, and the early moments are relaxed, even casual. Across the table sits Joy Behar, who, as longtime viewers know, often brings a direct and sometimes skeptical perspective to interviews. The conversation opens with general questions: his current projects, how he balances public life with private responsibilities, and the work he's been doing outside of entertainment. Kutcher answers in a measured tone, maintaining eye contact, occasionally smiling, and leaning slightly forward as he speaks, signaling engagement. The rest of the panel listens attentively. There are nods, a few light jokes, and brief moments of agreement. The studio audience reacts as expected. Soft laughter at humorous remarks, scattered applause when something resonates. At this stage, nothing feels out of the ordinary. As the discussion progresses, the tone subtly shifts when the topic moves toward broader social issues, something Kutcher has spoken about publicly before. He begins explaining his perspective in a calm, structured way, outlining not just his views, but also the experiences that shaped them. His delivery is steady, not confrontational, but clearly intentional. That's when Joy Behar leans in slightly, adjusting her posture. Her expression changes just enough to signal she's preparing to respond. She listens through the end of his sentence, but then interjects, not abruptly, but firmly enough to redirect the conversation. Her tone isn't hostile, but it carries a clear note of challenge. She raises a point that reframes what Kutcher has just said, offering a different angle, one that questions whether his perspective fully accounts for certain realities. It's the kind of pushback viewers of The View are used to: direct, conversational, and rooted in personal interpretation. Kutcher doesn't interrupt. Instead, he turns his head toward her, listening closely. There's a brief pause after she finishes, just long enough to create a noticeable shift in the room's energy. The audience quiets, sensing that the discussion has moved beyond surface-level conversation. When Kutcher responds, his tone remains calm, but there's a subtle firmness that wasn't as present before. He acknowledges her point first, which momentarily diffuses any tension, but then he carefully explains where he disagrees. His hands move slightly as he talks, not dramatically, but enough to emphasize certain words. The exchange remains respectful, but there's a clear difference in perspective now. Behar listens, her expression thoughtful but unconvinced. She nods at certain moments, but when Kutcher finishes, she follows up with another question, this time more pointed. The rest of the panel begins to engage more actively. One host briefly interjects to clarify a point, while another attempts to balance the conversation by highlighting a middle ground. The discussion becomes more layered, moving from a simple guest interview into a broader conversation with multiple viewpoints. What stands out is how controlled the exchange remains. There's no talking over each other, no raised voices, but the tension is evident in the pacing. Responses become slightly quicker, pauses slightly shorter, and the tone just a bit more deliberate. Kutcher continues to hold his position, but he does so without dismissing the opposing view. He leans back briefly, then forward again, maintaining a composed posture. Behar, on the other hand, maintains her direct style, occasionally gesturing with her hands as she speaks, reinforcing her points with emphasis rather than volume. The audience reacts in small but noticeable ways, some murmurs of agreement, a few scattered claps when certain points land. It's the kind of live reaction that adds another layer to the moment, reminding viewers that this isn't just a conversation between individuals, but one unfolding in front of a room full of people interpreting it in real time. As the segment continues, it becomes clear that this isn't a disagreement that will be quickly resolved. Instead, it evolves into a thoughtful back and forth, each side presenting their perspective without stepping outside the boundaries of a daytime talk show format. The camera occasionally cuts between close-ups, Kutcher listening intently, Behar preparing her next point, other hosts watching closely. These visual cues add to the sense that something more significant than a typical interview is unfolding, even if it remains grounded and controlled. What began as a routine conversation has now become a moment of genuine discussion, one where differing viewpoints are not just expressed but examined. And while the tone remains respectful, the underlying tension continues to build, setting the stage for what comes next. As the conversation continues, the shift that began moments earlier becomes more noticeable, not because voices are raised or anyone appears visibly upset, but because the rhythm of the discussion has changed. What was once a straightforward guest interview now carries the weight of a genuine exchange of perspectives, the kind that requires both sides to listen carefully while also standing firm in their own viewpoints. Ashton Kutcher remains composed, but there's a subtle change in how he delivers his responses. His sentences become slightly more deliberate, his pauses more intentional, as if he's choosing each word with greater care. He leans forward again, resting his hands lightly together before separating them to gesture as he explains his position further. It's not defensive, but it is more focused. Across the table, Joy Behar listens closely, her expression attentive but still firm. When Kutcher finishes his next point, she responds almost immediately, signaling that she's not entirely convinced. Her tone remains conversational, but the content of what she's saying adds another layer to the discussion. She introduces a broader concern, one that reframes the issue from a different perspective, and in doing so, gently challenges the assumptions behind Kutcher's argument. There's a brief moment where both pause, just a second or two, but it's enough for the audience to register the tension. It's not uncomfortable, but it's noticeable. The kind of pause that naturally happens when two people are considering how to respond without interrupting each other. One of the other co-hosts steps in at this point, offering a comment that seems aimed at balancing the conversation. Her tone is lighter, almost bridging the gap between the two perspectives. She acknowledges what Kutcher is saying while also validating Behar's concerns. It's a familiar dynamic on The View, the panel working together to keep the discussion moving while still allowing space for disagreement. Kutcher nods as she speaks, signaling that he's listening, and when he responds, he shifts slightly in his seat, turning his body just a bit more toward the entire panel rather than focusing only on Behar. It's a small but noticeable change, suggesting that he's addressing the group as a whole now, not just responding to one person. He clarifies his earlier point, adding more context and drawing on specific examples to support what he's saying. His tone remains steady, but there's a quiet emphasis in certain phrases, particularly when he speaks about intent and outcomes. It's clear he's trying to ensure that his perspective is fully understood, not just heard. Behar responds again, this time with a slightly different approach. Instead of directly challenging his point, she asks a question, one that invites further explanation but also subtly highlights where she sees a gap. Her delivery is measured, but there's an underlying persistence, a sense that she's not ready to move on from the topic just yet. The audience reacts softly, a mix of attentive silence and the occasional murmur. It's the kind of response that suggests people are following closely, processing what's being said rather than reacting emotionally. Kutcher takes a moment before answering. He briefly glances down, then back up, as if organizing his thoughts. When he speaks, his tone is slightly more reflective. He acknowledges the complexity of the issue, something that seems to resonate with the room. It's not a concession, but it does show a willingness to engage with the nuance of the conversation. At this point, the discussion begins to widen. Another host adds her perspective, bringing in a different angle that hadn't been addressed yet. This shifts the focus slightly, allowing the conversation to move beyond a one-on-one exchange and into a broader panel discussion. Even so, the core of the disagreement between Kutcher and Behar remains present. It's not dominating the conversation, but it's still there, influencing how each new point is introduced and received. Behar leans back slightly, then forward again as she listens to the others. When she speaks next, her tone softens just a bit, though her position doesn't change. She reiterates her main concern, but this time in a way that connects more directly with what the others have said. It's less about challenging Kutcher directly and more about reinforcing her perspective within the larger discussion. Kutcher responds with a nod before speaking again. There's a brief smile, not dismissive, but acknowledging the ongoing nature of the conversation. He reiterates his stance, but he does so by building on what's already been said rather than repeating himself. It's a subtle shift that keeps the discussion moving forward. The pacing of the segment remains steady, but there's an undercurrent of tension that continues to build, not in a dramatic way, but in the sense that neither side is fully yielding. Each response adds another layer, another point of consideration. The camera cuts to the audience briefly, showing attentive faces, some nodding, others simply watching. It reinforces the sense that this is a moment people are engaged with, not just passively observing. Back at the table, the conversation takes another slight turn when one of the hosts brings up a related topic, something that connects to the original discussion but introduces a new dimension. It's a natural progression, the kind that often happens in live talk shows when a conversation gains momentum. Kutcher engages with this new angle, offering his thoughts without hesitation. His tone remains consistent, calm, and measured, but there's a confidence in how he presents his perspective. He's not trying to dominate the conversation, but he's clearly invested in it. Behar listens, her expression thoughtful. When she responds, she acknowledges part of what he's said, but then pivots back to her original concern. It's a reminder that while the discussion may evolve, the core disagreement is still unresolved. At this point, the moderator begins to gently guide the conversation, ensuring that everyone has a chance to speak while also keeping the segment within its time constraints. It's a subtle shift, but it signals that the discussion is approaching a point where it will need to either move forward or begin to wrap up. Still, the exchange between Kutcher and Behar continues, now with a slightly more measured pace. Both seem aware of the time, choosing their words carefully, focusing on the most important points rather than extending the debate unnecessarily. The audience remains engaged, their reactions quiet but present. A few moments of light applause break through when certain points resonate, but overall, the atmosphere stays focused and attentive. As the segment moves toward its midpoint, it's clear that what began as a routine interview has become something more, a thoughtful, grounded discussion where differing perspectives are not just presented, but genuinely explored. And while the tone remains respectful, the underlying tension between those perspectives continues to shape the conversation, leaving viewers watching closely to see how it will ultimately unfold. As the segment moves further along, the discussion settles into a more deliberate rhythm, one where each response feels slightly more considered than before. The initial tension hasn't disappeared, but it has evolved into something more structured, less about immediate pushback and more about carefully explaining positions in a way that resonates not just with each other, but with the audience watching both in the studio and at home. Ashton Kutcher appears increasingly focused, maintaining steady eye contact with whoever is speaking, occasionally nodding as others contribute. His posture remains upright, but relaxed enough to signal that he's comfortable continuing the conversation. At the same time, there's a noticeable attentiveness in how he listens now, as if he's anticipating the direction each question or comment might take. Across from him, Joy Behar continues to engage with the discussion in her characteristic way, direct, thoughtful, and persistent. She doesn't interrupt unnecessarily, but when she does speak, it's with clear intent. By this point, her role in the exchange has shifted slightly from challenging individual statements to reinforcing a broader perspective she wants to ensure isn't overlooked. The conversation briefly transitions when another co-host brings up a related point, one that connects to the larger topic but introduces a more personal dimension. It's the kind of shift that often helps reset the tone of a discussion, and for a moment, the atmosphere softens. Kutcher responds to this new angle with a more reflective tone, sharing insights that feel less like argument and more like explanation. The audience responds with quiet attentiveness, some nodding, others leaning slightly forward in their seats. There's a sense that the room is following closely, not just reacting to individual lines, but absorbing the overall exchange. But the calm doesn't fully remove the earlier tension. When the conversation naturally circles back to the central topic, Behar re-enters with a follow-up that brings the focus right back to where the disagreement lies. This time, her delivery is slightly more precise, her question framed in a way that narrows the scope and makes it harder to generalize. Kutcher listens without interruption, his expression neutral but engaged. When she finishes, there's a brief pause, long enough to signal that he's considering how to respond, but not so long that it feels uncomfortable. He leans forward again, resting one hand lightly on the table as he begins to speak. His response is calm, but there's a subtle increase in emphasis. He clarifies a key point that he feels may have been misunderstood, carefully drawing a distinction between what he intended to say and how it might have been interpreted. It's not defensive, but it is firm, and it marks a moment where he's clearly pushing back rather than simply explaining. Behar reacts with a slight tilt of her head, listening closely. She doesn't immediately respond, allowing him to finish completely before jumping back in. That restraint adds to the sense that, while the exchange is tense, it remains controlled and respectful. When she does respond, her tone carries a touch more urgency, not louder, but more direct. She acknowledges his clarification, but then points out where she still sees an issue. It's a continuation of the same disagreement, but now with both sides having more clearly defined their positions. The rest of the panel becomes more active again at this stage. One host offers a perspective that attempts to connect the two viewpoints, suggesting that both may be addressing different aspects of the same issue. Another adds a brief comment that shifts the focus slightly, introducing a practical example that grounds the discussion in something more tangible. Kutcher engages with these points, nodding and occasionally offering brief responses before returning to the main thread. His tone remains even, but there's a noticeable consistency in how he reinforces his core message. He's not repeating himself, but he's ensuring that the central idea behind his perspective stays clear. Behar, meanwhile, continues to listen and respond with equal consistency. Her expressions, small nods, slight frowns of concentration, brief glances toward the audience, add to the sense that she's fully engaged, not just in the debate itself, but in how it's being received. The audience's reactions remain subtle but telling. There are moments where a point lands and draws a soft wave of applause, followed by moments of quiet reflection. It's the kind of engagement that suggests viewers are thinking through what's being said rather than reacting impulsively. At one point, the moderator steps in more noticeably, guiding the conversation with a question that reframes the discussion in broader terms. It's a strategic move, one that allows both Kutcher and Behar to step slightly outside the immediate back and forth and address the topic from a wider perspective. Kutcher takes this opportunity to expand on his viewpoint, speaking in a slightly more measured cadence. He outlines not just what he believes, but why he believes it, drawing connections between his experiences and the conclusions he's reached. His delivery is calm, but there's a quiet conviction behind it. Behar listens without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When she responds, she does so by acknowledging part of what he's said, but then carefully reintroducing her main concern. It's a subtle but effective way of keeping the conversation anchored to the point she feels is most important. The exchange continues in this manner for several more minutes, with each side presenting their perspective, responding to the other, and occasionally looping in the rest of the panel. The tone remains consistent, serious, respectful, and grounded in the format of a daytime talk show. What becomes increasingly clear is that neither Kutcher nor Behar is trying to win the conversation. Instead, both seem focused on ensuring their viewpoints are clearly understood. That dynamic keeps the discussion from escalating into something more heated, even as the tension remains present. As the segment approaches its later stages, there's a slight shift in pacing. Responses become a bit more concise, questions more focused. It's the natural progression of a live segment that's beginning to move toward its conclusion, even if the conversation itself feels like it could continue. The audience remains engaged, their attention steady. The energy in the room is different from the beginning, less lighthearted, more reflective, but still firmly within the tone of a daytime talk show discussion. Back at the table, the exchange between Kutcher and Behar continues, now with a clearer understanding of each other's positions. The disagreement hasn't been resolved, but it has been fully explored, with both sides having had the opportunity to articulate their perspectives in a way that feels complete. And as the moderator prepares to guide the conversation into its final moments, there's a sense that what viewers have just witnessed is something slightly more substantial than a typical segment. An exchange that, while calm and controlled, carried enough tension and depth to leave a lasting impression. As the conversation moves into its later moments, the tone shifts once again. This time not toward escalation, but toward resolution, or at least something close to it. The energy at the table becomes more measured, as if everyone involved recognizes that the segment is nearing its end and that whatever remains to be said needs to be expressed clearly and concisely. Ashton Kutcher sits slightly back in his chair now, though he remains engaged, his attention still fixed on the discussion. His earlier responses carried a steady firmness, but at this stage, there's a subtle sense of closure in how he speaks. He's no longer expanding his argument as much as he is reinforcing it, summarizing key points, clarifying intent, and making sure his perspective is fully understood before the conversation wraps. Across from him, Joy Behar mirrors that shift in a different way. She remains direct, but her tone softens slightly, transitioning from active challenge to thoughtful reflection. It's not a retreat from her earlier position, but rather a recognition that the discussion has reached a point where both sides have been clearly heard. The moderator gently steps in again, guiding the conversation with a question that invites final thoughts. It's framed broadly enough to allow each participant to contribute without reigniting the earlier tension. This is a familiar moment for viewers of The View, the point where a complex discussion is brought back into focus before the segment concludes. Kutcher responds first this time. His delivery is calm and steady, with a slight nod as he begins. He briefly acknowledges the conversation as a whole, mentioning how important it is to have these kinds of discussions in public spaces. It's a measured statement, one that doesn't revisit every detail, but instead emphasizes the value of dialogue itself. He then reiterates the core of his viewpoint, but in a more distilled form. His words are carefully chosen, and his tone carries a quiet confidence. There's no urgency in his voice now, just a clear, composed explanation. He gestures lightly with one hand, then lets it rest again, signaling that he's making a final point rather than continuing an argument. The audience responds with a small but noticeable round of applause. Not overwhelming, but enough to indicate appreciation for how he's expressed himself. It's the kind of reaction that reflects understanding rather than agreement alone. Behar follows, leaning slightly forward as she begins her closing remarks. Her tone is steady, thoughtful. She acknowledges parts of what Kutcher has said, even nodding briefly as she references his earlier points. At the same time, she reaffirms her own perspective, framing it in a way that feels less like opposition and more like a complementary viewpoint. It's a subtle but important shift. Instead of directly countering his statements, she positions her response as an additional layer to the conversation, something that broadens the discussion rather than narrowing it. Her delivery remains clear and confident, but there's a noticeable effort to keep the tone balanced. The rest of the panel contributes briefly, each offering short reflections that tie into the larger discussion. One host highlights the importance of understanding different perspectives, while another brings attention to how conversations like this can help audiences think more critically about complex issues. These comments serve to round out the segment, reinforcing the idea that the exchange has been meaningful, even without a definitive resolution. Throughout these final moments, the pacing becomes more deliberate. There are fewer interruptions, longer pauses between speakers, and a general sense that everyone is allowing each other the space to finish their thoughts. The earlier tension hasn't disappeared entirely, but it has softened into something more reflective. The camera captures a few close-up shots, Kutcher listening attentively, Behar maintaining eye contact as she finishes her remarks, the other hosts nodding in agreement or contemplation. These visual cues reinforce the tone of the moment, showing a group engaged in thoughtful conversation rather than conflict. The audience remains quiet for the most part, with occasional nods and soft reactions. There's a sense of attentiveness that carries through to the end, as if viewers are processing everything that's been said. As the moderator begins to wrap up the segment, there's a brief acknowledgement of the discussion itself. She thanks Kutcher for joining the show and for engaging so openly with the panel. Her tone is warm, appreciative, and consistent with the overall atmosphere of the closing moments. Kutcher responds with a polite smile and a short expression of gratitude. He glances briefly at the rest of the panel, nodding slightly, which feels like an acknowledgement of the exchange as a whole. It's a small gesture, but one that reflects the respectful nature of the conversation despite the disagreement. Behar also offers a brief closing comment, lighter in tone than before, which draws a soft laugh from the audience. It's not directly related to the earlier tension, but it serves as a gentle way to ease the segment back into the more familiar rhythm of the show. The moderator then transitions the show forward, signaling the end of the segment. The audience applauds more fully now, the sound filling the studio as the camera pulls back slightly to capture the entire table. The atmosphere feels settled, the earlier intensity giving way to a sense of closure. Even as the segment ends, there's a lingering impression of what just took place. Not because it was dramatic or confrontational, but because it was real. A conversation where differing perspectives were expressed clearly, challenged respectfully, and ultimately left open for viewers to consider. And as the show moves on to its next topic, That moment remains, quietly standing out as one of those instances where live television offers something more than routine discussion, something that feels genuine, thoughtful, and worth reflecting on. As the segment comes to a close and the show transitions forward, there's a brief moment where the energy in the studio shifts from focused discussion back to the familiar rhythm of daytime television. The applause continues for a few seconds longer than usual, not because of any dramatic moment, but because the audience seems to recognize that they've just witnessed a conversation that carried a bit more weight than the typical exchange. Ashton Kutcher remains seated for a moment as the camera pulls back, offering a final nod to the panel. His expression is calm, composed, and reflective, consistent with how he handled the entire discussion. There's no visible frustration or tension lingering in his demeanor, just a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation reached its natural endpoint. Across the table, Joy Behar adjusts slightly in her seat, her posture relaxing as the segment officially ends. She exchanges a brief glance with the other hosts, followed by a small, knowing smile that suggests the discussion, while firm at times, remained within the bounds of what the show is known for: open, direct, and respectful. The moderator offers a final transition into the next segment, her tone upbeat and steady, signaling to viewers that the show is moving on. The camera cuts to a wider shot of the table, then briefly to the audience, where applause continues before gradually fading as the broadcast shifts focus. But even as the program continues, the conversation between Kutcher and Behar lingers, not just in the studio, but among viewers watching at home. Moments like these tend to resonate beyond the immediate broadcast, and this one is no exception. Shortly after the episode airs, clips of the exchange begin circulating online. Viewers revisit specific moments: Kutcher's calm but firm responses, Behar's direct and persistent questioning, and the way the rest of the panel helped guide the discussion without allowing it to become unbalanced. These clips are shared and discussed across platforms, with audiences offering a wide range of reactions. Some viewers express appreciation for how Ashton Kutcher handled the situation, pointing out his composure and willingness to engage without becoming defensive. Others highlight Joy Behar's role in pressing important questions, noting that her approach ensured the conversation didn't stay on the surface. There are also viewers who focus on the broader dynamic of the panel, observing how the hosts of The View worked together to maintain balance. Comments often mention the way the discussion was guided, how interruptions were minimal, how each perspective was given space, and how the moderator kept the segment moving without cutting off meaningful points. As the discussion spreads online, different interpretations begin to emerge. Some see the exchange as a model for respectful disagreement, where two people with differing views can engage without raising their voices or losing focus. Others view it as a reminder of how complex certain topics can be, especially when discussed in a live, unscripted setting. Media outlets and commentary channels pick up on the moment as well, referencing it as part of a broader conversation about how public figures handle differing viewpoints in real time. The tone of these discussions remains largely consistent with what was seen on air, measured, analytical, and focused on the substance of what was said rather than any dramatic framing. In the hours following the broadcast, there are also brief clarifications shared through interviews and social media posts. These aren't responses to controversy, but rather extensions of the conversation. Kutcher reiterates some of the points he made on the show, providing additional context for viewers who may have only seen short clips. Behar, in her own way, acknowledges the discussion as part of the show's ongoing commitment to open dialogue. What stands out most in these follow-ups is the consistency in tone. Neither side attempts to reframe the exchange as something more dramatic than it was. Instead, both treat it as a normal, if slightly more in-depth, moment of discussion, one that reflects the purpose of a show like The View. Back in the studio, behind the scenes, the atmosphere reportedly remains professional and steady. Moments after the segment ends, the hosts reset for the next topic, exchanging brief comments and returning to their usual flow. It's a reminder that while the conversation may feel significant to viewers, for those involved, it's part of the daily rhythm of live television. For the audience, however, the impact is a bit more lasting. Viewers continue to revisit the exchange, not because it was loud or confrontational, but because it felt genuine. It offered a glimpse into how real conversations can unfold when people take the time to listen, respond, and stay engaged without letting the discussion lose its sense of balance. As the episode becomes part of the show's archive, It joins a long list of moments that reflect what daytime talk shows aim to do at their best: bring together different perspectives, allow them to be heard, and leave space for the audience to draw their own conclusions. And in the end, that's what this exchange between Ashton Kutcher and Joy Behar ultimately represents. Not a confrontation, not a resolution, but a conversation. One that unfolded in real time, remained grounded in respect, and continued to resonate even after the cameras moved on. If you watched this moment, or if you've seen the clips since, it's the kind of discussion that naturally invites reflection. Different viewers will take away different things, and that's part of what makes these conversations meaningful. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.